Cogito Ergo Sum. I think, therefore I am. These are perhaps the most famous words in all of philosophy, but we rarely stop to consider what they actually mean, and whether it is a good argument in the first place. After all, what could be more obvious than our own existence? But as we shall see, the matter is far more complicated than it might first appear. And even the father of modern philosophy is capable of logical error. Get ready to learn why an evil demon might be controlling all of your thoughts and perceptions, how Descartes doesn't care how many limbs I have, and how the most well-known argument in philosophy can challenge our very sense of self. Before we begin, remember that there is a vast literature on this topic, far more than I know and far more than I can cover here. So I encourage you to absorb these ideas critically. But first, who came up with this argument, and why did they feel the need to prove something that was so obvious? Well, it is all to do with doubt. 1. I doubt, therefore I panic. One day, in the mid-17th century, French philosopher, mathematician and scientist Rene Descartes sat down by the fire and decided he was going to systematically doubt every one of his beliefs and rebuild his knowledge from the ground up, in order to see what human reason could really do. His motives for this are somewhat philosophical and somewhat theological, and I won't quite get into them here. But he wanted to create a certain foundation for human knowledge, including human knowledge of God. So he begins this grand project by imagining all the possible scenarios where he might be wrong about things. At first, he reflects that sometimes his physical senses deceive him, making him see one thing when another actually exists. Next, he points out that when he is dreaming, he never realizes he's in a dream until he wakes up. So perhaps he is dreaming all the time and simply doesn't realize it. But finally, he concedes the possibility of an omnipotent evil demon that could be deceiving his senses at all times, replacing every true belief with a false one and every accurate perception with an inaccurate one. He reflects that such a demon could also deceive his reason, so that he could think that 2 + 2 = 4 when it actually equals 5, or that a triangle has 3 sides when it actually has 7, and so on. The upshot is this: every one of our beliefs, every one of our perceptions, they can all be, theoretically, doubted, undermining any hope for a certain foundation for human knowledge. This scenario makes Descartes incredibly distressed, and it throws him into a philosophical panic. Can he really be certain of none of his beliefs? Such an idea seems intolerable to him, and so he searches for some small crumb of certainty, hoping that he can build outwards from there to reconstruct his entire belief system. Eventually, he reasons that if he is doubting all of his beliefs, then doubt must exist, and furthermore, there must be something to doubt, i.e. a doubter, and that doubter must be him. Thus, he concludes that whether he knows anything else, he knows that he exists. This is indubitable. That is, he cannot doubt it. This argument is first found in the Meditations and is later clarified in his Principles of Philosophy. If we were being philosophically precise, then we could formulate this argument into 3 premises and a conclusion. I have based mine here on Bertrand Russell's own work with the argument. 1. There is my doubt. 2. If there is doubt, there must exist a doubter. 3. That doubter is referred to as I. Conclusion: I exist. This argument is normally referred to as the cogito argument, or I think, therefore I am. But if we look carefully, it's actually slightly subtler than this presentation makes it appear. Descartes is attempting to combat his own radical doubt, and the strength of this argument hinges on the fact that you cannot doubt that doubt exists. Since the moment you begin to doubt it, you refute yourself. It is like saying, I am speechless. If it were true, then you could not say it. And since Descartes thinks that doubt is a species of thinking, he says that we must exist as thinkers. Now, there are a number of different formulations and interpretations of this argument. This is just one of them. One debate is over whether Descartes meant this to be a strictly logical argument, or rather something more primal, a sort of philosophical intuition. I won't discuss this particular dispute here, as Alex O'Connor already has a video on it that I will link in the description. I instead want to discuss what this argument actually proves. Is it sound, and does it actually place our own existence beyond any doubt, or show that it's true? Which, as we will see, are 2 separate things. So, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of the argument and see if it holds water. But first, if you want to help me make more videos like this, consider subscribing to my channel or my email list or my Patreon if you're feeling very generous. The links are in the description. 2. I think, therefore what? Let's revisit the argument that Descartes presents in full again. As we can see, in this formulation we have 3 premises and a conclusion. The first premise seems pretty strong. It is presupposed by the very issue Descartes is trying to solve, that of him doubting all of his beliefs. So, if doubts did not exist, there would be no problem in the first place, and we can forget the whole issue. We could all just retreat back into philosophical contentment. So, I'm going to label the first premise as very defensible. And the third premise is somewhat solid as well. It seems part of the meaning of the indexical symbol I that it refers to the speaker. So if the argument is being presented by the person doubting, doubting, then it seems to hold firm. There are arguments against this, most famously from Bertrand Russell, but I'll set those aside for now and just assume this premise. But it is in the second premise that we see a real weak point in Descartes' argument. If we are throwing all of our beliefs into question, can we really say that doubt cannot exist without a doubter? Could we not imagine a world where doubt exists by itself, without any need for someone doubting? We actually use this sort of wording in our everyday speech when we say there are doubts about something, rather than referring to specific doubters. So, is this where Descartes' argument begins to fall apart? This is the point where many people will cry out, but that's just ridiculous. We know that doubt doesn't exist without someone to doubt. That is surely true. But remember that Descartes is trying to create certain knowledge, so he cannot appeal to the fallible observation that doubts and doubters actually exist together in the real world. He must prove from first principles that doubt and doubters cannot, even conceptually, be separated. So at first glance, it seems that Descartes has not shown that we exist, but rather simply that doubt exists. If this is true, then despite all appearances, there is a possibility that you, watching this video, yes, you right now, actually don't exist. But in my opinion, this criticism only works if we take a very particular view on Descartes' argument. Namely, that he is trying to show that the statement I exist must be true via logical argumentation. But this may be a misunderstanding of what the great French mathematician was aiming for. In Meditations, he actually does not say that he's looking for a belief that is true, but rather one that he simply cannot doubt. This might seem at first to be a trivial distinction, but in this context it really matters. After all, we can imagine something that's possibly false, but for some reason we simply cannot disbelieve it. Some people have proposed the existence of other minds to be just one example of this. It is a theoretical possibility that other people do not have thoughts, feelings, perceptions, or ideas, and are in fact unconscious automata. But nonetheless, I cannot bring myself to believe this. It is something I cannot seem to doubt in practice, but nonetheless may be false. It could be that Descartes is not saying I exist must be true, but rather that I exist cannot be doubted by its speaker. Alex O'Connor's video also touches upon this point, but I want to explore it further here. If we take this interpretation of Descartes, we might reformulate his argument like this. 1. The existence of my own doubt cannot be doubted. 2. If I cannot doubt the existence of my doubt, then I also cannot doubt the existence of a doubter. 3. I call this doubter I. Conclusion, I cannot doubt that I exist. I see this as a more robust version of Descartes' argument for two reasons. The first is that it is couched in psychological terms, making it much easier to verify. You could make a positive argument that actually you cannot doubt that a doubter exists if you cannot doubt that a doubt exists. That is, that the two concepts are so inextricably linked in your head that you cannot prise them apart. And the second is that in avoiding the notion of truth, it also fits much more comfortably into a world where we are actually being deceived by an evil demon. It allows us to say, I could not exist, but I cannot doubt that I exist. This might come across as a bit confusing, but in my opinion it's actually a much more defensible position, and it's closer to the actual persuasive force of I think therefore I am. The thing that makes this argument convincing for so many people is that it seems impossible to think the phrase I think without the I referring back to a speaker, namely the person thinking it, and bringing them into existence as a presupposition. Of course, it's worth noting here that if the third premise of the original argument is false, then we cannot make this move, but I will leave you to debate this in the comments. This formulation also brings the skeptical challenge that all our beliefs might be false a bit more down to earth. Surely what makes a skeptical scenario genuinely distressing is the idea that we can doubt all our beliefs in the same practical way that we can think that we've misheard someone's speech or misremembered someone's face. But if Descartes has shown that we cannot doubt all our beliefs in this manner, then he's gone some way to responding to the skeptical challenge. But whatever you think of Descartes' argument, let's examine its consequences if it is sound. And foremost among those consequences is the picture it paints of the human mind. 3. I think, therefore, existence is fleeting. If we carefully consider Descartes' argument, we can see that it actually only proves a certain kind of existence. That is, existence while we are thinking as a thinking thing. As I said before, one perspective on Descartes' argument is that it constructs a self-verifying sentence. At any moment you are thinking, you can say I exist, and it will verify itself. If you did not exist, you could not formulate the thought that you do exist, and as a result, your existence is verified at the very same moment the statement is thought. The trouble with this is, it only actually secures your existence while you are actively thinking. That is, if you were to stop thinking, even for a millisecond, then Descartes' argument would no longer hold, and your existence would be thrown into question again. If we follow Descartes' philosophy further, the situation is actually much more dire than this. Descartes infers from his Cogito argument that if we exist, we must do so fundamentally as thinking things. This makes sense from his his perspective. He wants to show that the human soul is immortal and separable from the body, and defining it by thinking makes his task much easier. As well as this, it is the only kind of existence that is guaranteed by a successful cogito argument. But this also makes the problem we just discussed much worse. Then, when we stop thinking, we actually do cease to exist. We lose the very thing that defines us. Descartes may have demonstrated our existence at some point in time, but if we take his definition of a person seriously, if we ever stop thinking, we will just pop out of existence. And there is also another key way in which the cogito argument would only prove a very limited version of existence. When people invoke this argument, they're often attempting to show that they exist with all of their ordinary qualities. That is, if I were to invoke the argument, I would be proving that I exist as someone called Joe who enjoys philosophy writing and sometimes makes mistakes in his research. But Descartes' argument fails to show this at all. None of my wants, desires, mental properties, or even preferences are shown to exist. It is simply me as I think. I may not even be correct about the contents of my thoughts. I may think that I'm thinking about Descartes right now, but I'm actually thinking about a man called Ted who lives in Sunderland. The literal only thing that Descartes' argument shows, if it is successful, is the existence of me as something that is thinking. No other properties could be inferred from a successful cogito argument. And this is not by any means a criticism of Descartes, as he would probably agree with this. The cogito argument for him is just a stepping stone to a series of arguments about the nature of our existence, the accuracy of our other beliefs, and the properties of God. But it is an important caveat to how the cogito argument is used in practice. We must bear in mind that its scope is actually very limited. We don't even gain privileged access to the contents of our own mind, merely a reassurance that it exists in some way. At first, this renders Descartes' argument a lot less impactful than it initially seemed. It gave the impression that it would safeguard our existence, us as our minds, with all their usual properties. But on closer inspection, it can only rescue a very impoverished version of who we are. This makes perfect sense in the context of Descartes' overall project, but it is far less than most people hope for from this argument. I have sometimes seen this painted as a knockdown argument for the cogito, that Descartes has tried to prove something substantial and has failed, rescuing only a sliver of what constitutes personal existence. But I want to propose the slightly controversial view that this is only right and proper. Contrary to popular opinion, we don't have infallible access to the contents of our own minds. That is, I may think that I am thinking one thing, but I am actually thinking another. I may misperceive my own perceptions and misfeel my own feelings. And to show this, I'm going to need the help of a fantastically original philosopher, Erich Schwitzgebel. For I think, therefore I mistake. If I asked you to picture a blue elephant, you could obviously do so. It appears self-evident that you cannot be mistaken that what you are picturing is actually a blue elephant. On first examination, it seems that whatever doubts we have about the external world, we cannot be wrong about the contents of our own minds and the contents of our own perceptions. Even Descartes is convinced on this point. We could imagine an argument structurally very similar to the cogito argument to support this. If an evil demon were deceiving us, we would nonetheless have to have an accurate view on the contents of those deceptions. Otherwise, the deceptions just might not work. If a demon made it so that every time I saw an apple, my sense perceptions were twisted so that I perceived an orange instead, I would still be right about the contents of my own perceptions. Whatever was going on in the real world, if I said, I am perceiving an orange, I would be correct. It is a sort of, I am deceived, therefore I perceive. But Erich Schwitzgebel raises a series of counterexamples to this seemingly obvious point, and shows that we can make mistakes about the contents of our own minds. First, he points to our emotional states. Is it really so inconceivable that I could be wrong about what I am feeling? An old acquaintance of mine studied many years to become a licensed therapist, and something she says she's helped multiple clients with is their inability to perceive their own emotional states, or to misperceive them. They might mistake sadness for anger, or anger for fear. No evil demon is needed to show that we can be wrong about the contents of our emotional states. It happens all the time. It's not even that uncommon to hear people say, I don't know how I feel, especially in romantic contexts. So is it really that far-fetched to think that while we know that we exist, we can make numerous errors in judgment as to who we actually are? Remember, we are looking for indubitable knowledge, and it seems like we don't have it here. But perhaps you think emotions are a special case. Surely we can't be wrong about the contents of our own perceptions. But unfortunately, even they are not immune to self-deception. If you ask most people offhandedly to estimate how much of their vision they think is clear, then provided that they have no major sight impairment, they will tend to say that all but the very edges of their vision is crystal clear. But you can test whether this is the case right now in this video. Keep your eyes focused on one spot on the screen, and try to bring your attention to the world around that spot without moving your eyes. You will find that a few degrees from the center of your vision, it will immediately start to blur. I once did this demonstration during a presentation when I was at Cambridge, and it was amazing to see see how it dawned on the audience how their vision was so much less clear than they initially thought. They knew what peripheral vision was, of course, but the speed at which the clarity of your sight decays as you leave the centre of your view left many of them genuinely astonished. They were mistaken about the contents of their own perceptions. 2 points to the skeptic, 0 points to introspective privilege. And this is not to mention all of the different psychological and psychoanalytic theories that show how we could be mistaken about all manner of aspects of our inner experience. From notions of repressed trauma to unconsciously motivated behaviours, there are a litany of psychological theories that paint us as fundamentally mistaken about the contents of our own minds. Even if you are sceptical of some of them, invoking infallible introspective knowledge would require rejecting all of them, which is a much more difficult task. So perhaps Descartes has done only what is possible within the bounds of logic. A successful cogito argument may only show that we exist or our existence is beyond doubt in a very limited way. But it seems that any attempt to establish infallible knowledge of ourselves beyond this would be highly questionable. After all, we didn't even have to invoke thought experiments. We have here 3 everyday examples of deceived introspection, and we were only just getting started. In some ways, this is a defense of both Descartes and the skeptic. The skeptic has gained some important territory. We have conceded that even our introspection is fallible. But in some ways, we've given a defense of the scope of Descartes' original argument. It is not fair to criticize someone for achieving what is likely impossible, given our counterexamples. So to say that Descartes' cogito argument has fallen short of demonstrating a substantial notion of the self is accurate. But that is hardly our fine French mathematicians' fault. It is simply the limits of what logic can do. But I want to end this video by exploring an argument that runs almost directly parallel to Descartes', formulated by monks hundreds of years before he existed, and with almost the exact opposite conclusion. 5. I think, therefore I'm not. It is central to the tradition which Descartes came from that the self remains undivided. If the self could be fragmented into pieces, then maybe the soul could as well, and theological chaos would ensue. But if we let go of this position, then we can uncover another perspective on how our ability to think relates to the self. One that comes from early Buddhist thinkers, and argues that our thinking is fantastic evidence that, in fact, we do not exist. At least not as one undivided entity, as Descartes would like. I will be using an edited and simplified version of a much grander argument made by many Buddhist philosophers, but I will link the passage of philosophy that I'm referring to in the description. This new argument starts with the observation that our thoughts undergo moment-to-moment change. 1 minute they might dwell on the blue elephant, and the next what we had for dinner, and then some deep-seated anxiety, and then right back to the blue elephant again. At no point do we see any single thread that links these thoughts together into one permanent object that we could call the self or the soul. There are only a series of disparate parts. The same goes for our feelings. One moment we might feel happy, the next we might feel sad, then we might feel angry, with no permanent emotional through line that we can identify a permanent unchanging self with. We can even apply the same arguments to our memories. Our memories change over time. They are edited when we recall them, and they fade out of existence if they go unused. So even our memories are not unchanging or permanent, but are instead just another example of an ever-altering string of disconnected objects that we call with the same label merely for convenience's sake. Of course, if we did not have mental operations, then things would not be that much better. We would still undergo physical changes, and the idea that inanimate objects can have a self or a soul seems much less plausible than when we apply it to thinking things, though some have argued that seemingly inanimate objects are actually conscious in some way. I'll link an article on panpsychism in the description for those interested, slightly mad, and deeply admirable viewers. So it seems that either way we cut it, the standard notion of I that we present to the world is under dire threat. I love this argument because it starts with the same general premises as Descartes, that we are thinking things. Yet it arrives at an entirely different conclusion, that there is no such thing as an undivided, permanent self. Of course, there are ways we can respond to this argument. We could appeal to an idea of continuity between our perceptions or of our memories, or introduce the self as a concept to explain why all of these disparate states seem so connected. I'm not suggesting that we should all immediately abandon any notion of the self, but I bring this argument up because it illustrates an interesting point about Descartes' own perspective. Descartes' argument aims to show that we exist in a very particular way. That is, as an undivided, thinking thing. And in some ways, this conception of who we are is the most interesting part of the argument. It places our thoughts at the very centre of what makes us human. This idea was inherited from Plato and Aristotle, and it moves through the ages to touch us here today. Most of us identify very strongly with our thoughts and our inner world, usually far more so than anything physical, like the shape of our bodies or the colour of our hair. And the worldviews hidden in arguments like this fascinate me, because it makes me think about all of the philosophy that has shaped our ideas of ourselves and society that we aren't even aware of. Before reading Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, and Kant, I had no idea where I'd inherited this idea that humans were fundamentally thinking creatures. And before reading someone like Nietzsche, I hadn't had these ideas challenged in such a profound way. And I think this is part of what makes philosophy so impactful. It can shape the assumptions that we don't even know we have. Perhaps we are a thinking thing. Perhaps we are an impermanent self. Perhaps we never existed after all. But whatever is actually the case, we owe a lot of how we conceive of ourselves to the philosophical traditions that have been around long before us and will remain long after we are gone. And I think that's really quite beautiful. If you want more perspectives on personhood, click here to learn how Jean-Paul Sartre thought our minds were influenced by the judgments of others. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.